So when I was asked to present our keynote speaker, the first thing I did was I went next door to where his office is adjacent to mine, and my question to him was, how did we meet? And how long ago was that? And we both stared at each other and decided after 5 silent minutes that it was too long to even remember. What I can say about Tali Hairston is that Tali has always been that person that you want in the room when things are heating up. Tali is also the kind of person who can take conflict and begin to tease out the different threads that have become embroiled. Tali is someone who has the innate ability to try on different lenses from which to view the world and to listen to people. This was brought home to me a few years ago when he and I accompanied a group from Seattle Presbytery to the Presbytery of the North Coast in Colombia, South America. We arrived there during the season of Carnival when a lot of different caricatures and a lot of different animated people dress up in different forms. And there happened to be also a group of seminarian students from a Presbyterian seminary visiting at the same time we were there. It just so happened that these students had visited one of the local towns as they were preparing for Carnival and were extremely offended by some of the displays that they saw, which included blackface. Most of these students were African American. At the same time, Tali and the rest of us with Seattle Presbytery were there to hear the stories of campesinos, farm workers, who had been displaced due to violence, either paramilitary or narco-traffickants, or the government. Tali stepped into a classroom where there were wounded, broken African-American students, as well as wounded, broken campesinos, and was able to draw a very wide circle around everyone, where stories could be shared, where tears could be wept, and our brokenness could be lifted up. It was not made whole in that time. I don't think Tali was setting out to make people whole, but Tali had the incredible ability to make us all stop, listen, and feel in solidarity. That's why for me it's such a tremendous treat, a true blessing, to be able to share my friend and colleague and sometimes mentor and oftentimes little brother, the almost Dr. Reverend Tali Hairston, to all of you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Buenos tardes. Welcome to Seattle. Bienvenidos. I was born and raised in Seattle, just a side note. Don't add this to my time, but that's this. You got, as a black preacher, you are very aware of time in the Presbyterian church. Born and raised in Seattle, and one of the things that I love to do when I'm talking to folks in Seattle is to make sure that people are aware that there's a group of folks who about 12,000 years ago made their way, as most historians would know, through Siberia down to Alaska, down through to what we now call the United States, and settled here in between the Cascade Mountains and the Olympic Mountains, between Portland and Vancouver, and for nearly 12,000 years lived on this land. And we honor them today for their welcome that they provided to some settlers who made their way to Seattle and were near death when they stumbled across the hospitality of the Duwamish people many years ago. And so we honor them today before we get started. And in tradition of African American community, I'd love to ask that the elder of African American community, if you are willing, will you give me permission to take part in telling our story? So you can just do that by shouting yes. Thank you very much. It's appreciated. What I find is that most folks, when we're engaging cross-culturally, we just know a little too little about each other's cultures, and having the boldness sometimes to share our cultural norms with each other in a hospitable way, of course, is a part of the work of reconciliation. I'm a part of the Presbytery now, and my pastor and friend Lena Thompson is here, where my wife and I attend Lake Berrien Presbyterian Church. I also work in with the Presbyterian staff, the Presbyterian office, and my office is over there, and it's really cool to learn a lot about what it means to be Presbyterian. And my wife was here. I don't know if she still is. Is she there? Oh, there you are. There you are. Yeah, there she is. Okay, great. I lost her for a minute, so. And I was concerned because I lost her. It's like, no, where are you? So the aha moment for me in this work came about 6 or 7 years ago, but it didn't start there. It was a part of a long journey that began also with a Presbyterian congregation, Mercer Island Presbyterian. They organized a trip to South Africa, and they asked me to attend that trip. And on that trip in South Africa, this was maybe the second trip that we were on in South Africa, working in a neighborhood called Tembisa, South Africa. And we were doing work around this little school in townships. Mind you, at this point in time, apartheid had come to an end, and they were really in a redevelopment mode. And the townships that everyone was about speaking to and transforming by ending apartheid had now come to the place where they realized there were no schools in the townships. And so we were there to ask the question, what are people doing about there being no schools in townships? And I found myself at breakfast having tea after just kind of whimsically we just went to St. George Parish and tried to figure out if we could get into, and we heard that Bishop Desmond Tutu was there, and we walked in, and a friend of a friend of a friend was there from World Vision, hosted us up to the front, and we took communion served by Bishop Desmond Tutu. And in that moment, my eyes were as big as saucers. They then invited us to have tea, and I don't know what I ordered. I can't tell you. I don't even know what we ate. I don't even know where it is. I just know we walked, and Desmond Tutu was here, and I was here, right? That's all I remember. And then I had the opportunity to ask a question of Bishop Tutu. And when I asked the question of Bishop Desmond Tutu, it was a very simple question. What do you think should be done about education in townships? And he said, well, first he laughed. And if any of you have ever had interaction with Bishop Desmond Tutu, he's a funny person. Now, he's only this tall, but he's a funny person. And he proceeded to laugh, and then he had little cards where it showed a picture of his birthday that he had just celebrated, and he was handing them out. It was so funny. And he looked at me and he laughed, and he said, "You ask a big question." And he said, "And that's for you to answer." Yeah. I don't know how long I prayed about that interaction, but what I realized was that his words had incited something in me that has continued to this day. And so for the last 12 to 15 years, I've been working on how we articulate the kind of thing that would help people experience transformation in this work we call reconciliation. And so, with that as an introduction, let me see if I can not look at myself there and look at this here. Okay. All right. It's like, it's so easy to look at the big screens, but they put these down here for me. I got it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I want to start with retelling the story of Naomi. And I'm going to use something that I like to call a socio-cultural situated approach. Don't worry about that. You'll kind of hear my head as I start to retell the story of Naomi. So Naomi's story at this point in her life is that she is this suburban dweller of Bethlehem, an Ephrathite. And as we heard this morning, it wasn't far from Bellingham. It wasn't far from Bethlehem. It wasn't far. For those who don't know, Bellingham's a city just up the road. Okay. And it was like a neighborhood of Bethlehem, probably a wealthy neighborhood given her husband's status. But Ephrathites means fruitful, which should not be lost in us in this story. If anything, this story is about how God redeems those marginalized within this system. And fruitfulness is the language of redemption in this story. Famine had come to Bethlehem, and it causes displacement of Naomi's family. They then become the foreigners in this new land called Moab, right? They become a part of this new country. They were seeking refuge there from famine. Now, it must have been a huge famine. Why? Because wealthy folk usually don't have to move. They usually don't experience displacement. Usually it's the poor who experience displacement when famine hits and become refugees. So it must have been a serious famine. So as refugees, the husband and sons, though, die in the new land. Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws, these Moabite daughters. Okay? Now, my theological training didn't need to kick in to help us with this one, right? Well, let me tell the story first, and then we'll come back to how Moab became this country and where that history is. So they began to reconcile their relationship after death of the sons and the husband. Naomi had heard that God blessed the people in her hometown, and now there was food again. He told her daughter-in-laws, "You should stay here, go back to your land, and I'm going to go back to my land." Ruth decides to sojourn with her, though, to sojourn with Naomi. Okay, it is Ruth's commitment to be with Naomi on this journey. And the reality is, we know very little about Ruth. You ever get that when you read this? What do we know about Ruth? Now, this isn't a sermon, but if it was, I would tell you, talk back to me. So what I'm going to need you to do is I've been very methodical so far in just taking my time and warming you up, because now we're going to talk to one another, okay? Now, if you told me that you are giving a sermon, we wouldn't be talking like this, but this is not a sermon, and I don't have 20 minutes, okay? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to need you to tell me what you know about Ruth from the story. Exactly. She knows how to work. We know that much. and she knows how to glean. We know that much. We know where she's from. We know that much. But you know what? Oftentimes in these type of stories, the voice that's minimized is a historical reality in telling stories. The way that the story is told matters. And even in this story, the voice, the narrative, does not tell us much about the redeeming actor. Similarly, when we tell the story, oftentimes we don't hear much about Sojourner Truth's life. Who was she? We don't hear the story of Fannie Lou Hamer. Who was she? We don't hear the story, but yet we call them huge historical figures, but we don't know much about who they are. Because the way the story is told matters. And Ruth's life is not very well known. That is not something we should just pass over. We must pay attention to that how we tell the story is often told from the perspective of those in power and not from the perspective of those without power. See, Ruth's origin story matters. This is the difference between telling the story from the position of those who won the battle and telling the story from the position of those who did not. Historians and archaeologists have actually located writings in the historic country of Moab that list the interactions between Israel and Moab. And do you know that they tell a different story? Right? Ruth, and I always wonder sometimes, how did the book of Ruth even get in there? How did it qualify? How did it even get in there? Who slipped it in? Right? Who snuck it under the door in developing the King James Version? Right? Do they know what it really means to tell this story in a way that is actually not scandalous, but scandalous? But let's look at the story of Ruth based on where she comes from. Let's tell that story. See, Moab was located on a trade route. It was a long, well-traveled journey between what they called the King's Highway that the country was on, which means, and there was a lot of trade, which means that if she was a child in that community growing up, she would have experienced multinational interactions and people coming from all parts and walks of life. She would have grown up with that as her natural inclination, that there are people from all over the world who come to the Fertile Crescent and travel trading up and down. She would have been a global child. She would have been aware of the interactions between multicultural, multi-state, multinational groups. She wouldn't have been ignorant of that. She would have been informed of that. That much we know about her history. She's easily aware of other cultures and ethnicities, their histories, and their belief systems because her country, her town, her village is located in a place where there's trade. Much trade and interaction. And so that's all we know about her, but it's enough to tell us about her lifestyle and a little bit about her cultural awareness. And regardless of whether it is minimized, like many others in the story, in history, the story is told by those that did not control the narrative. Even though she is the redemptive agent, like many women today who are redemptive agents in patriarchal societies and patriarchal systems, they act as, and in fact, I would be remiss as an African American to not say something about the role that women play in the African American story, which is not read. You we want to celebrate Martin Luther King all we want to. We want to celebrate Malcolm X all we want to. We want to celebrate black males, but get something straight. Without the women in the story of the African American tradition, we would not be here. We would not be here. The African American church is rooted in a matriarchy, not a patriarchy. And no matter how much my brothers would argue with me about the role of men in the church, I go by experience. And the experience tells me that women run this place, and you better check with mama and grandma of the church before. And I have no problem saying, this is my grandmother's church. And you go, what does that have to do with anything, Tali? What does that have to do with anything? Well, check this out. When you look at the origin story of Moab, it's told in a few sentences in the book of Genesis. Moab is the sister to Israel through Daddy Lot. And Daddy Lot violated his daughter, and their son is named Moab. Moab is nephew to Abraham. So the plan of redemption runs through the incestuous interaction where a man violates his daughter. But here's another thing that you should think about in that. Where does the plan for redemption in this story come from? Who writes it? Naomi. Not Boaz. Naomi writes the story and communicates it to Ruth. And Ruth takes it to Boaz. You can't tell this story and not tell it from the perspective of the one who writes the redemptive act. The ministry strategy comes from Naomi, the one who is no longer fruitful because the Almighty, she says, has abandoned her. And she writes the redemptive plan. See, Boaz advocates for the plan to the power brokers, but it's Naomi and Ruth who enact the plan at the grassroots level. And then Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a baby. The Bible says, then the women said to Naomi, not the men, the women say to the Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day, to Naomi, not Ruth, to Naomi. Naomi and Ruth are not blood related, folks. Do you see how scandalous this is? The women say to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. This became David's grandfather. David's grandfather is born to a Moabite. Can I get even more plain? David's grandson is born to a relationship between a Moabite and an Israelite. Right? This is messy, y'all. This is messy. Okay. I want to do something because I see some of you are like, oh, no, he's about to go there and this is going to get ugly. Here's what I need you to do. They handed out a piece of paper for you, okay? And on one side, you're going to write questions for our Q&A time after this. I was going to wear tennis shoes, so when I finish, I could just run out and y'all couldn't catch me. But instead, I wore my teaching shoes because I'm just like, I'm not afraid of y'all. I'm going to be like, I'm not afraid. On the other side, that you're writing questions. On the other side, I want you to do something for me. I want you to write down the answer to this question for you. What does belonging look like for you? Describe the word belonging for you. Describe the word belonging for you. So now we're at the place in the story, we've reached the end of this narrative where David's grandfather is a descendant of a Moabite woman. I don't know if you have heard much about mitochondrial DNA, right? I mean, maybe a few of us, but like it doesn't show up like on your Facebook page, like today in mitochondrial DNA, right? It doesn't hit the news. But literally, mitochondrial DNA is a recent discovery. But what it essentially says is that everyone born of a woman has a certain DNA marker that comes from that woman. And it only comes through the woman only, okay? And it gets passed down from woman to woman, which is why you're able to now to do DNA testing on your matrilineal side, that it does not happen for the patrilineal side. So we can trace your mother's, but we cannot trace your father's in the same way. God created us with this marker that our mamas give to us. And it gets passed down, whether you're male or female, it gets passed down. So in the African American tradition, where in the United States there were fathers who were not African American, when you're doing DNA testing, they tell you, do not do your patrilineal side, because we already know historically that many did not have an African father, put it that way, okay? What did we have? Well, we knew we were born to descendants of Africa on the matriarchal side. And so we do our testing largely on the matriarch of our history, the matrilineal side. This is important to note then, that when you do the descendancy of Jesus, you come to this place where this Moabite woman, who is a descendant of an ancestral relationship, is named as a descendant of Jesus. That Jesus is a descendant of this Moabite woman. Yeah. And so I wonder sometimes what the church is thinking when it tries to purify itself as it is the descendant of people who have always been okay. When the church is really a cacophony and amalgamation of dirty, messed up folks who have never had it right and have never had it all together and have never figured it out how to be together, instead have tried to play as if we understood right from wrong always. No, that is a mythology. Right? That's a mythology. It's such a strong mythology that we actually think today some Christian aspects of who we are, right, are this idea of purity. Purity, which was the genesis, of course, the origin story of racism. Like, that is so far from Jesus' story. So far from Jesus' story. See, we must learn to tell the origin story from the perspective of the indigenous people. Why? Because it is centered around the power powerlessness of the indigenous folk. When we tell the story from the winning side, it tends to be skewed towards I'll be nice. I told Eliana I'll be nice. This is my office is just down the way. Y'all know where I live. It's different if I flew here, because then I could just get on the plane and you can't find me. I'm gonna be nice. So let's just say the indigenous history is of great value to the redemptive story of any people. Of any people. Can I say that again for the folks in the back and online? The story of indigenous people is important and imperative to the redemptive story. And when you leave them out, you are augmenting and editing the salvific story. You're editing it, and it's necessary for us to then pay attention to the origin story. Instead then of a transaction between Ruth and Boaz, which is the way the system was supposed to work, a transformational relationship occurred, not a transactional relationship occurred. Transformational relationships require those with power to be uncomfortable. Boaz became uncomfortable. Our need for the comfortable can delay God's work for transformation. When the powerful become uncomfortable, it is the first step to transformational relationships. But as long as you want to stay comfortable, you can only manage a transactional relationship and not a transformational one. Transactional relationships is, here, I give you this, and you give me something in return. Transformation is a whole separate kind of experience. But what we have come to are Christians who understand transaction but not transformation. And oftentimes, if we refuse to give up comfort, we end up with transactional relationships that sustain marginalization. They sustain it. They sustain it because in order for me to maintain this transaction, I have to objectify and dehumanize you in order to get the best value out of this transaction. That is problematic to the nature of the kingdom of God. Just a little. Just a little, right? See, Boaz chose to engage the uncomfortable position he was put in when Ruth showed up at his feet. Read it. He was uncomfortable. And instead advocates in that uncomfortability, advocates for Naomi's redemption. That advocacy he engaged was based not in objectification, but mutuality. He decided to mutually engage the plan of redemption, not charity. See, the system was he was supposed to act charitably towards them. He didn't have to love or care for them or consider their story. He simply could have acted out of charity. Can I just say a little bit about charity in the church? See, the charity I'm referring to is when we do for people and not with people. We do for people when we do not believe in their capacity or their ability. We do for people when they are not our equals. We do for people when we fail to see they are made in the image of God. And we do for people when we think that God is not already talking to them. That's the kind of charity. Not the kind of charity I did with my daughter the other week when I helped her out with some lunch money. That was charity. She didn't earn it. She didn't do the dishes. But when she was going with her friends, she needed $10. It's like, cool. You didn't earn it, but I'm going to give it to you. That's not the kind of charity I'm talking about. I'm talking about the charity that includes 500 years of colonial missiology where we had to make people in our image and not the image of God. That is the kind of charity. That kind of charity that shrouded missiology for 500 plus years, where people were made to feel as if their cultural norms were not appropriate for God, as if we knew. That is the kind of charity. Boaz doesn't do that. Boaz does advocacy and mutuality that leads to transformation. Advocacy based in mutuality that leads to transformation. He doesn't tell Naomi, I have a better story. I have a better strategy. He doesn't tell Naomi, who are you to tell me what to do because I'm Boaz. Doesn't do that. And as many trips that I've been on around the world, I oftentimes have to tell people I'm traveling with, look, God showed up here way before you did on that 747. Chances are God's already been speaking. Maybe the job is for us to listen to the story of the people because God is going to show up in the story of the people. That's how that happens. God shows up in the story of the people. That's why the story matters so much. Lastly, in this story, we learn transformational relationships subvert oppressive systems. Her plan subverted the oppressive system, not sustained it. See, we have learned how to do ways that accommodate the system and have us participate marginally with the system, knowing it's a bad system that produces largely white male leadership, and we just go, well, we can say that and have a hand-holding session that makes us feel good that we were together on that Sunday, and then go back to our segregated neighborhoods and segregated towns and segregated jobs. But Christ has called us to transforming subversive systems. And he does that very simply. Mutuality and advocacy lead to transformation. Boaz didn't have to have all the right answers. He listened to Naomi and to Ruth. Mind you, he didn't talk to Naomi. He talked to Ruth. He talked to the young gleaner. I was going to say young millennial, but the young gleaner. If the church is going to be transformed, it's going to be transformed because it listens to young people. Yeah, I know. I have a middle schooler. She talks when you pick her up. She'll talk for an hour all the way home. And sometimes, to be honest, I don't want to listen. But when I do, I learn more about how I don't perceive life in a way that can be transformative because I have been enculturated to accept certain norms and traditions that keep her voice from being heard. See, Ruth and Naomi's relationship subverts the system that said with no sons and no daughters, no son and no husband, she would experience generational poverty and a lack of wealth, a lack of a future. So let's review. Transformational relationships subvert oppressive systems. The foundation for transformation is built on being uncomfortable and advocating in mutuality, not charity. The challenge of being uncomfortable is a real one. See, Naomi then, in this space of transformation, Naomi finds belonging with Ruth. Naomi finds belonging with Ruth. And it is their relationship that subverts the oppressive system. Okay? Now remember I told you to look for belonging. Describe it, right? So shout out some of your ideas around belonging. Because it's when we find belonging it becomes transformational. Okay? Naomi found belonging with Ruth, and their relationship became the basis of subverting oppressive systems. Any relationship where there is belonging, it can become subversive to oppressive systems. Why did I choose belonging? Well, we recently did a lot of research around this idea of a sense of belonging. Number one reason that people stay at a job today, not advancement, not money, belonging. Higher education, recent studies on sense of belonging. Why do students choose a school and stay at a school? Not because of how much it cost or didn't cost, not even because of the program. What is it? Sense of belonging. So I looked deeper into sense of belonging, and we started to ask people to define sense of belonging for us, because it is an indicator of the possibility of transformation. You can't transform something where there is no sense of belonging. When there's no sense of belonging, you are a customer of and a client, not a member of a community. So shout out for me what you see as belonging. Just shout it out. Acceptance. Advocacy. Welcome. Say that again. Trust. Okay. Vulnerability. Respect. Okay. If you had trust anywhere on your list, stand up. I have done this over 30 times. I knew the answer I would get in asking that question. For those who can't see, there's maybe about 10 people in this whole room, 12 people, 13 people. Let's be generous. There are 40 people in here. Of how many? 500 or so who had trust. But how many of you would ever get into a relationship and find belonging when there's no trust? Why is that? Why, when I freely ask you to define belonging for yourself, trust often gets left off the list? Like I said, I've done this 30 times in different parts of the country, nearly different parts of the world, and the same answer comes up. Trust often is left off the list of what belonging means. And I started to ask myself why, and then I realized this story is important to informing this problem. We have been enculturated. Here's the answer. We have been enculturated to have relationship with no trust. We have been enculturated to change maladaptively ourselves to be and experience belonging with no trust. And this is highly problematic to cross-cultural relationships. Because you can engage cross-culturally where everyone makes mistakes all the time about what to say, what to sing, and how to say it, without the benefit of the doubt that the person meant well, but is doing harm. And so the impact is terrible of engaging cross-culturally, so we stay out of it. And that's problematic because you're not going to ever do the kind of cross-cultural reconciliation work without making mistakes. And if you don't have trust built into the relationship, then simply you have no way of belonging and creating belonging. You have a way of creating clients and consumers, but not a way of creating belonging. And so we went deeper into belonging. And we pulled apart belonging in an attempt to really understand the nature on how we think race or any social cultural identity. We began studying how stories worked in our brains. Why did we need the story? What is the purpose of story in creating belonging? I was at Duke Divinity's Reconciliation Institute a few years ago when Dr. Jeremy Bigby shared with us about the nature of music. And here is what I began working on from his teaching. We are created to resolve the story. So a song begins with a home chord, Bethlehem, and moves away from that chord through dissonance, Moab. We stay in dissonance until the chord is transformed. Ruth makes a commitment to Naomi. Its transformations then, when they return home, look different, is slightly changed. Naomi's story is changed when she gets back home. This is how we use story. We use story as a way of creating identity and belonging. We use story to create identity and belonging. Stories give shape to place, whether myths or not, and we are shaped by the story of a place. See, this is another reason why origin stories matter. We have to get them right. Second is stories have the ability to shape place, and we are shaped by the story of a place. We are designed, though, and this is what many people will argue with me about is, look, I'm not shaped by the place, but do you know we are susceptible as in how God made us? Just check this out. I could turn the heat up and your body would start to sweat. You don't have to tell it not to sweat or to sweat. It does it automatically. We are susceptible. Our skin is permeable. We are the only species, literally, that has no fur of its own. We're created to need a covering, right? And that's because our bodies are permeable to the conditions outside of itself. This is hugely important when we begin to look at how stories shaped us, how stories impacted us, how stories had a way of moving in our cognitive capacity. See, we are designed then to find belonging in story. And this comes from the work of Philip Sheldrake, a former Episcopal bishop. And he wrote, belonging and story are related in that they describe what we internally integrated and what we externally adapted to. Okay? We use story as a way of describing how we are internally adapting and externally integrating. That process of adaptation and integration are something we're doing all the time and negotiating all the time. And so when I began at the very beginning to tell you about the African American tradition, I wasn't doing it accidentally or incidentally. I was doing it on purpose to try and get a new story into your space. Right? Because I know you're susceptible and permeable to story, right? And that you're seeking to put identity and belonging together in a story. Okay? So for example, let me give an example. Integration is like looking in the mirror and seeing yourself. Okay? Adaptation is when you look outside the window and see other people. You're looking at other people and looking at their story and going, do I want to adapt what they're doing into this? But when you look at yourself in the mirror, you're looking at what you've already integrated into who you are. Do you see then the problem when we have children who don't see themselves in the mirror, but only see others when they look outside? See, the reason that the kids act up the way they do is in part because they have learned how to only look out the window, but not in the mirror. So when you don't tell the sermon in a way that honors the origin story, that woman of color was in the story and she had an active role in the story and writing the redemptive narrative, what you're saying is keep looking out the window of other people, because that's what really matters, is that you're looking out the window at other people. This comes from the work of Emily Stiles, who talked about curriculum as window and mirror, and that when you read a book, sometimes you don't see yourself, but then there are others who always see themselves. that always see themselves. And when they always see themselves, they develop strong senses of identity, where others of us develop a duality that is often called a double consciousness by some African-American intellectuals. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about this, that there's a double consciousness we develop. The way I like to say it is, I had to learn how to sing the song like y'all sing it, and then I had to learn the song like we sing it. It's the same song, but there's just a different way to sing the song. So when I started singing Be Thou My Vision, I had to realize there was a different way that we sang Be Thou My Vision, but I had to learn your way to sing it, but that you only had to learn your way of singing it. And you know what we call diversity? We call diversity is when I learn how to sing it the way you sing it. That's diversity. But you know what equity and justice is? Equity and justice is when you have the privilege of learning to sing it my way and your way, just like me. Right? And then you become better because now you're able to sing it in more than one way. You're able to look outside the window and see others singing it, and you're able then to look in the mirror and see yourself singing it. And now this is how we are created to be able to be multivalent, the ability in our brains, multivalence, is to be able to see window and mirror at the same time. But when we studied teachers in school, when we asked them to engage multiculturalism and inclusion, they said the same thing that pastors said. We can't do that. That's too hard. Too difficult. See, this wonderful book by Philip Sheldrake tells this story in a very profound way. He says in 2001, the book was written, and it's called Spaces for the Sacred. In Spaces for the Sacred, and I'll explain more about belonging and story in the workshop that I'm doing after this, where we'll go into detail about how the stories work. He says, this helps us to know who we are and to whom we belong. Therefore, narrative is a critical key to our identity. For we all need story to live by in order to make sense of the otherwise unrelated events of life and to find dignity. So when the story is never about you, you end up with internalizing whatever is in that space. When you are never at the center of the story, you end up internalizing that rejection. When you have to fight to exist within your own mirror, when you have to resist accepting what others think about you, stereotype threat. When the space you inhabit says you are not normal, and you internalize that, especially children, you should not be surprised when the babies act out. Because we have taught them don't care about you. We have taught them don't care about their identity and to barely know their purpose. And in many ways, you can be as nice as you want to be. Yeah. The issue is not, we found, about how nice you are. It's that their story is never in the space. And as long as their story is never in the space, we found people say, well, she was nice, but I didn't want to stay at that church. They had a great music team. They were really trying, but I just didn't feel like I belonged. Why? Their story was never in the space. And so we developed a way for people to understand more about what their story is. And we developed a way of telling story, and we asked people if you could tell your story just using these 5 lenses, what would you do? And we just let them tell their story. And then we had them get up and tell their story in front of people. And we do this in sessions all the time now. And no matter how many times we do it, we end up with the same response, the same similar things happen. For instance, whenever you're telling something that you know a lot about, your brain does something that your body can't change, right? Your brain is doing something that you can't fix, right? When you know something really well, your body starts to respond, right? Your eyes become a certain way, your head turns a certain way. You may talk, the space between the words gets smaller because it's on the top of mind. It's at the frontal lobe. You think about these things all the time. And the more you think about something, the more you develop a lexicon for it. You have multiple words for it. So whenever we talk to students, let's say college students in a Christian university about gender and race, in their story, we said use examples, tell us when you first learned about it, just go and do it, right? Just share it all. Literally, young white girls would say, I'm a girl with girl parts. Is that all your brain has for that in your story? Yeah, I mean, my dad really didn't say anything about it. The sermon, did you hear a sermon? No sermon about it. Can you share anything about education? Yeah, there were some things about education, and my mom went to school, and she made a big deal about saying things that were important to us going to school, and then Dad, he was like, everyone's going to college in this family, and then, see the difference? We found that there were differences that were, that were consistent and measured differently. Before, we looked at these all as the same. But when we had people tell their stories according to them, they were different. And when we had a Hispanic male, a Latino male come up and say his story, one time he said it like this. He said, I'm not going to say it in Spanish because I'll mess it up, but how important his auntie was and his mother were for the work he was doing in school, and that he had learned how, and he said it quick, and he said it fast, and he said it in a hurry, and he went on for minutes. What that tells us when we started to study situated cognition was that his brain had more language for it because it was a ready experience that had markers that were connected to his identity that he could easily pull from. You put him in the room with other students who do not have those markers, that's not much of a conversation. And that's what happens every day in church. When you put people together who have a different matrix, they have a tough time talking because I see Jesus in such a way that I talk about him from that perspective of what's readily available to a young boy who in the 4th grade was called the N-word, and by the 7th grade was reading Cornel West, and by the 11th grade could tell you everything about what it meant to be a black boy in the United States. Why? Those experiences had formed my language and my capacity to talk and experience those things. And I shared those things with people who had no experience of race when I got to college. And I interpreted their not having language about race as racism. But more importantly, not that that's not important, but more importantly, I then had no need to have relationship with them because there was no connection. I found no belonging because our stories were not connected. We have gone so far as to say the people that you're in relationship with and go to church with are so, not because of the great music, not because of the great preaching, not because of where the church is located, not because they let you bring your dog in the service. Not even because they have a great latte machine. It's because they have your story. Why do students choose to go to a particular college? It's their story. And this is their story, these 5 lenses. I always get pushback on this, so I'll just put it out there now as we move into Q&A's time. I'll put this out there now. Why did you choose these 5? And I have a very simple response. We chose these 5 based on one question. Name one war that didn't include these. Name one war that did not include these. War, slavery, $1 million projects, $1 billion projects that killed folk after folk after folk and communities after communities were based in large part off of these. And so we wanted to know, based on what's called situated cognition, how our brains actually work, why people who were, I'll even make it messier. You know how people look at me and they go, well, you have brown skin, and then they look at a person next to me who has brown skin, and they go, I need to treat you both the same, right? And what we found out was that this brown person could have a completely different matrix than this other brown person, and that they were completely different people. But because we do things based on race, you see the same people, I see the same people, and not different people. And so we can't even let people of color be diverse within themselves, because we have to treat them as a monolith. They're all the same, and they're not. And they're not. In fact, we then took white folks and said, you're not all the same either. Right? And they were shocked to hear that. They were surprised, right? They were surprised. But here's the story that really makes this hard to hear for some folks. When we ask white folks, tell your cultural story, tell your ethnic story, you know what the response was. We don't have one. We're American, right? But that's a profound diminishment of how God created you to work in and among what's called enculturation. You are designed to integrate and adapt. That's what you're designed to do. That's how God created us. And so when we minimize culture, we're minimizing creation. We're minimizing it. We're minimizing how God called us to do this, right? In the midst of, I'll stop there. I could go on for hours. I just got started on telling you about this, and I'll conclude with this. Okay, I'll conclude with this. Okay, I get so excited. Okay, I'll conclude with this. What do you think happens when people who have different different matrix, what do you think their first thing to do is when they're trying to work across those differences? What do you think their first thing to do is?
Talk about themselves.
Yes. Number one thing, right? Talk about themselves. And you know what? That's the right thing to do. This is what we found out. Insight precedes eyesight. And the problem was, when you're in the majority, you never have to interrogate your whiteness. You never have to, because it's something you don't have to think about. It becomes, it's called situated cognition for a reason. If you, on your way to work every day, you know what happens? You do the same thing every day, all the time. You know what your brain does? It shuts down the information coming in on the left and the right. It doesn't need to know it. Your brain is better at forgetting than it is remembering. Right? Your brain is very efficient like that. Your brain is seeking to forget more than it is to remember. It wants to remember only what's necessary to keep you alive and functioning and communicative. That's what it's trying to do. So your brain forgets the fact that you are driving down a road with the same material left and right, because you do it every day. It's not necessary to food or flight, right? It's not going to feed you and it's not going to kill you. So you just keep going down that same road. Your brain turns it off. It's called situated cognition. So what happens when you become so familiar with whiteness? You forget about it. You don't know it, and you don't interrogate it. So the first thing to do is to talk about yourself. It is an interrogation of yourself. When you're a minority, you know what you have to do all the time? Learn the other person. It is a constant cross-cultural impact. That means I become more aware of you than I even am of myself. I'm smiling because I know it hurts. Right? So insight precedes eyesight. The only way you're going to see rightly is if you interrogate your own culture and your own self. So in conclusion, Jesus did it this way. Jesus became famous for telling his own people they were wrong and telling Come on, you got to finish like this. We got to finish strong. Okay, Jesus was famous for telling his own people, you vipers. But then he went to Nicodemus and he had a great conversation of salvation. He went to the Roman centurion soldier, the occupying force of Israel, and said, I have not found no greater faith, no, not even in my hometown. And you know what we do? The complete opposite. We interrogate others and affirm ourselves. And Jesus says no. Insight precedes eyesight. And if you want to see the other clearly, you've got to see yourself better. God bless you. Thank you, Thomas. Bless you. God bless you. God bless you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Okay, so do you see why we just had to share him? I also forgot to tell you that he's a brainiac, so that's
I'm
the
a
other
nerd.
thing.
I'm a nerd.
Yeah, nerd. We at the end of your pews are these little slips of green paper for you to write down a question. We've got some folks that'll go around, just kind of lift it up like this when you're ready to bring a question over, and we will be asking Tali questions. And you can ask them anything.
Yeah, I have a thick skin.
But I have the first question.
Okay.
I was intrigued about that chart you had of the categories.
Yes.
And I'd like you to, if you could address a little bit the intersectionality of those categories, because I think, at least in my perception, the church has gotten caught in focusing on one or the other.
Sure.
And what can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so these categories are very overlapping, and they're what we call intersectional. And sometimes you're going to hear, if you've been in this work, intersectionality has become a buzzword. And what I want you to do is go back to the original work that was done by a black woman on intersectionality and start there, because it has gotten changed since it left her heart, okay, since it left her mind. So what intersectionality then is, in part, is that the way that these, and if you might want to put back on screen that last slide, because what intersectionality is when certain sections or certain lenses overlap one another significantly in society. So I am probably more black than I am male for some folks in society. And it's because those overlap significantly in my experience, right? And so for black women, the more, and some people go, well, the more intersectionality you have, like black female, highly intersect, then the more victimization she's going to experience. That's not what the original intersectionality work said. That wasn't the point. The point was that where these intersect, or where these identities come together, people can experience multiple things, a variety of things, depending on where they are in society. And so the original intersectionality work was not based on like the more lenses you have overlapping, then the more victimization. No. The problem with intersectionality in this discussion is we try and stay away from intersectionality from the standpoint that it's not the way where your brains work necessarily. And so your brains tend to work in a matrix, and that's why we call it a matrix. They're kind of all flowing together in some way that get worked out in how you, and put it this way, they get worked out in what you remember. Okay, in what you remember. And I use this example because it can work really well. Have you ever bought something like a car, and all of a sudden you drive off the lot, and what happens? You see that car, right? Yeah, my wife, she just left because she had to go pick up the kids from school. And one of the things she did when she bought her little Kia Soul is the guy told her, like, this car is everywhere in Seattle. Like, you're going to see it everywhere. And she drives off the lot 7 days later. What do you think she says to me while we're eating dinner? I see the car everywhere. Her brain saw it before, but her brain didn't have a marker for it. So her brain didn't make a schematic for a schema in her brain to go, there it is, and right? So there are things you're seeing that you're not seeing because you don't have a marker for it. So that's why you can say, I'm colorblind, because really you don't see race, because you don't have any language for it. Right? So you are colorblind. Literally, you do not have language for race. That's where that essentially comes from. Your brain is saying, I don't have any language for race. And so you say to your congregation or to your folks, I just see you as Lena. I don't see you as a woman of color. Right? You're colorblind. Literally, your brain's going, I don't have any way of talking about race. So what we have to do is change that. We got to get your brain talking about race. So it has a marker for it. Because then you will start to see people as people. Right?
We have a question here. Someone's asking about that same matrix.
Sure.
Where does sexuality and able-bodiedness come into that?
Right. This is not a comprehensive piece. So what we didn't want to do was act like I was trying to write a matrix for everything. Where sexuality is highly what we call correlated, and this is with gender. So gender identity and sexual orientation, and the way people tell stories right now is highly what's called correlated. If we separated them out, they would still do the same thing because they're correlated. So as one goes up, the other goes up, right? So we use gender because what happened was it's interchangeable. We could have said sexuality, and it would have done the same thing. We just chose gender because in the work we were doing, it was more identifiable for people. But if I were doing this internationally, I'd probably say sexuality. If I was doing this in a different, I would use sexuality because they're interchangeable in how people tell their stories. So this is based on how people tell their stories, not necessarily on different classifications, which is the way, so critical race theory and the way that the civil rights orientation created a narrative, the narrative it created was classifications. And that's why you have to put you're Caucasian on your census, even though none of you have been from the Caucasus Mountains, and right? Exactly, right? Because those classifications were created for civil rights understandings. What we were doing was a cognitive map of how our brains orient ourselves around categories. And the same thing with able-bodied. It's highly correlated, yeah.
Let's switch over to Ruth.
Yes.
Where do you see yourself in the story of Ruth, Tali, and with whom do you identify with?
Yeah, I identify with Boaz because my story, the way my father and my uncles raised us, the way we were taught, that it was highly stratified. Guys do this, girls do this, women can't be this, men can be this. And so I grew up with that orientation, and Boaz is for me that type of person who sits at the place of being on the margins. So I understand how gender, I basically grew up understanding how gender can be used as a tool to diminish other people. But then as a black man, I understood how marginalization worked. And when I see Boaz, I see someone who understood how to have compassion because he understood what gleaning meant. He understood poverty. He somehow was able to identify. Boaz says something that's really important. Boaz actually tells the young men to protect Ruth. Yeah, so that's huge. Boaz had what we call empathy or compassion, right? And he says, protect her. And he tells the young men to give her more, right? And he's understanding something. And so for me, I identify with Boaz because I come from a tradition that said men are better, but I then am exposed to a tradition that says we ought to have empathy on people who are marginalized. And that confusion is Boaz, and that confusion is Tali.
Thank you. This question. Today's Black Youth Project published an article called I Have No Interest in White Allies by Gwezi Lake, saying, quote, the revolution can't be sponsored and or acceptable to those we are revolting against. So the writer of this note, not me, says, don't be nice, be honest. What are your thoughts?
I haven't read the article. but I'm very familiar with the argument. And using, I will say, just based on what we're learning about the way our brains work, they have a lot of credibility here, just based on our brains and how they work. I use this as a metaphor only to try and communicate to you kind of what this is like. I would not ask you if you've never fixed a car, don't know anything about cars, to help me fix my car. And what we have to admit is that there are people who don't know anything. They don't think they don't think they're cultural. They don't know their ethnicity, and they haven't talked about issues of race. And then we try and bring them into, right, this process. And really, instead of bringing them into a process where we are trying to lead change, where they don't know anything about that, there has to be a step before that where you're doing your own work to understand race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender identity. You're doing that work on your own, so when you come to the conversation, you have something to offer. And what we're finding is when people go through that process, then those who are standing to try and lead changes in society, they're more welcoming and hospitable because that person has done their work. What I can't do is try and raise my African-American son in the city and raise you. Mm-hmm. I need you to raise yourself, and I can help you and coach you, but I can't involve you because I'm trying to save my son from getting shot for doing something he didn't do. Okay? Right? So it's more of a both and than is it either or. The encouragement there is for all of us to do the work that God has called us to do on ourselves, because insight precedes eyesight.
Along those lines, what do you believe it will cost white people to interrogate their whiteness?
Yeah, 1950, this was in the 50s, and the monk, Thomas Merton wrote a book, powerful, where he says, the cost to white society to make this change is essentially more than they're willing to pay, but the cost is immense. That's not my words. That was his words in 1951, I think, when he wrote that book. That's the challenge, right, is that there's a cost that white folks will have to pay, not because you did something, but because you inherited something. Okay? And I was doing, I won't name the Presbyterian church, but my wife and I, they asked us to come for dinner with their congregation, and I gave an example of a young African-American boy goes to fourth grade class, and he gets a marble in each class. At the end of the school year, he has all of his marbles, and he goes, "Mom, look, I have all my marbles." And then she looks over and sees that all the other kids have more marbles. And he says to the parent says to the teacher, "How come my son has less marbles than everyone else?" And she says, "That's just the way it is." And I asked the congregation, "What do you do about that?" And this is what the response was. I kid you not. Guy raised his hand and he said, "Look, we have the marbles and we're not giving them up." And I said, I just quoted the text, the Bible. I said to him, "And you have your reward." Right?
Yep. Our final question for this afternoon, Tali. Mm-hmm. What is the role of confession and forgiveness in restoring good relationships with cultural awareness?
Why would this have to be the last question? Confession and forgiveness? Yeah. Can you do me a favor? There's a book, Soong Chang Ra wrote a book on Lament recently, maybe 2 years ago. Can we start with Lament first? Because when we jump to confession and forgiveness without lament, confession becomes Confession becomes a perfunctory exercise of people who feel guilty. Okay? Lament is a spiritual practice of engaging, becoming aware of what one really is a part of. And when we become aware of what we're really a part of, no matter who we are, to put it bluntly, in America, we have a need to lament. We need to lament. We need to lament because of what we're all a part of, right? We're a part of a nation that jails more people than any other developing nation. We're a part of a country that has the largest military budget in the world. We need to lament that. Why? Lament makes us able to be compassionate. Without lament, you move to confession with no compassion. And confession with no compassion is a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. It's empty. It's empty, right? And here's the thing I love about people who've been minority or marginalized. This sixth sense that when someone has truly lamented, their actions can still be wrong, but you can sense, am I wrong about that? Exactly. You have this sixth sense like, no, they're really lamenting and they're aware. And that awareness is producing a confession. I just want to say this and then I'll sit down. I need everyone who has white guilt to just leave it in the seat when you leave today. White guilt is not helping you or anyone else. Guilt becomes disabling. It weakens your ability to actually function in a way that creates opportunity for transformation. What guilt ends up doing is, you call then the local pastor of color and you guys do a pulpit exchange. That's what guilt does, but then you don't talk the rest of this year. That's guilt. What guilt does is you call someone on MLK Day to preach, but you don't talk about the text as a multi-ethnic, multicultural text. Right, that's guilt. Instead of guilt, you can truly move into awareness and lament that leads to confession that's filled with compassion. You can. Why? That's what God calls us to, and that's literally what the Holy Spirit is trying to do in us every day on any subject, is move us from lament to compassion to confession, and then no one has a problem with forgiving you. But if you're gonna come with guilty, white guilt, what's gonna happen is you're gonna ask us for forgiveness like we have something to give you. You haven't given us anything to give you. You haven't given us anything. If you give us lament, then we can do what the scripture says, and we can lament together. The Bible says, mourn with them that mourn. And so if you're gonna mourn about the situations in this country related to race or sexual identity or gender orientation, you know what we're called to do? To mourn with you. To mourn with you. And in that mourning, there's a possibility of transformation. Without that, you give us guilt, and we can't give you anything for guilt. There's nothing there's nothing to give you. It's just nothing to give you. So please leave it at the seats. When you walk out, you are free to leave guilt, and you're free to walk in a true lament that causes eyes to open and ears to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. God bless you.